Did you know that, in a sense, New York City had its own Area 51? That's right, there's a secret island right off the coast of the city that's been shrouded in mystery for over 50 years. This 3-mile-long forbidden zone has been hidden from prying eyes and cameras for decades. But in the past few years, the veil has started to lift, and today we'll uncover its secret past. So join me as we discover the history of Plum Island. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Plum Island is the largest of 3 islands extending northeasternly from the North Fork of Long Island into Long Island Sound, created by a moraine, or an accumulation of rocks and dirt from glaciers, pushed up after the last of them receded around 15,000 years ago. You can actually still see some of the boulders from this event on the northern slope of the island. The Native American Pequot Nation named the island Manitowut during their inhabitation of it. This lasted until 1659, when a Dutchman named Samuel Willis approached the ruling chief of most of Long Island with a deal. Anyhow, Europeans had their eyes on the island since the Dutch West India Company first charted the area in 1614, where the name Plum Island comes from. Willis wanted to purchase the island, and the chief was willing to part ways with it. The recorded purchase price was, quote, 1 coat, 1 barrel of biscuits, and 100 fishhooks. However, transactions such as these were culturally difficult. The Native Americans of the region believed the land belonged to everyone. From their view, this deal just gave the Europeans fishing and hunting rights. Anyhow, the chief wasn't the only claimant of the island. He had 3 brothers of note, one of whom actually made a separate deal for Plum Island in 1665. While the exact details of the following conflicts are lost to us, we do know that the disputes ended in favor of the original deal made with Willis, likely due to how the chief's other brothers died, leaving him the sole chief of Long Island. From here, Plum Island remained in the background for the next 100 years or so, until it rocketed back into prominence as one of the first battles between the British and colonial troops during the American Revolution. Ordered by George Washington on August the 11th, 1775, General David Wooster and his troops landed where the historic lighthouse currently sits to prevent livestock raids from the British garrison there. After receiving fire from the British, the troops retreated across the water back to Orient Point. This was the American military's first amphibious assault, albeit unsuccessful. After this, the island's history remained generally uneventful until 1827, when the previously mentioned lighthouse was constructed. Ownership of the island passed between over 20 families until 1899. Following the Spanish-American War, the United States government bought Plum Island, establishing a coast artillery post known as Fort Terry. It was reactivated as an anti-submarine base during the Second World War, after which it was promptly deactivated. While kept under very tight guard, Plum Island was very busy during the Cold War. And although activities there at the time were not public knowledge, we do know that its primary role under government ownership has always been as the Plum Island Animal Disease Center, which studies several livestock-related illnesses. Plans for an animal research facility began in 1952 with the reactivation and transfer of Fort Terry to the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, which required remodeling of 18 buildings, a task only partly completed by May of 1954. This laboratory never opened and was never the predecessor to the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. The United States Department of Agriculture had already made plans for a facility to study foot and mouth disease, a contagious viral disease of cattle and swine known for fever and blisters around the mouth and hoofs that had numerous outbreaks in Mexico and Canada in the years leading up to this. After urging Congress to authorize the facility, it opened in June of 1954, consequently closing the island to public to minimize the risk of spreading diseases. But before we go any further, we should clear up a few things about the nature of the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. For starters, the facility only researches transboundary animal diseases that are not transmissible to humans. So why am I pointing that out? Well, there's a popular misconception that Lyme disease originates from this lab. It doesn't. It should also be pointed out that this island does not perform any classified research, as all studies from the lab are submitted for peer review in national and international scientific journals. Anyhow, during the days following World War II, there was a push to weaponize some of the facility's research. The U.S. Army Chemical Corps buildings were still present and complete, hence they needed to be integrated into the facility's research program. During the early days of the Cold War, research was not limited to foot and mouth disease. Foreign animal diseases were also brought in for study to develop biological weapons for use against animals in the event of the Cold War turning hot. However, with President Richard Nixon's cancellation of the weapon research program in 1969, this strain of research ended. As time marched on, the facilities gradually became more outdated. In 1977, the Department of Agriculture acted on this with a modernization plan, expanding the site with new facilities. However, an outbreak of foot and mouth disease occurred on the island during this modernization, halting any progress. Well, these diseases can't infect humans. Any infected material in contact with an animal would publicize the disaster, forcing the entire facility to undergo rigorous cleaning. This event was noteworthy for more than just delaying the renovation process, since it's an outlier in an otherwise airtight safety record. As far as facilities of this nature go, they were reported to be among the cleanest in the world, if not the cleanest. There are several other precautions in place at the facility to prevent outbreaks. For example, upon arrival, employees change into sterile government-issued garments, and before leaving, the employees are thoroughly sanitized before even being allowed to change back into their civilian clothing. Any non-human materials are sterilized twice with pressurized, high-temperature steam. On top of all of this, all laboratories are designed with negative pressure, drawing air inward instead of pushing out, and this is a helpful feature in the event of an air leak. Biologists also work on samples with special fume hoods and 2 different kinds of decontaminants for equipment. Through all of this, and for the greater good, the island remained closed to outsiders to minimize the risk of outbreaks. Another security method to make sure that diseases never spread include the incineration of all test animals at the end of their trial. Despite the horrific nature of this, the labs claim to make a priority of treating the animals as humanely and ethically as possible, given the circumstances. However, any deer that occasionally swims onto the island are killed and also incinerated. And as dramatic as that might sound, it doesn't exactly mean that the area is entirely closed off. Visitors have arrived at the island previously, as the government wants to maintain that image of secure but not secretive. However, it's debatable as to if the reality of the situation matches the intentions. You see, historically speaking, arranging a visit has always been a very exhausting process, requiring advance clearance for any visitors to go through the same sanitation practices that the staff experience. Armed guards also search any visitor upon arrival and departure, following them around wherever they go on the island. They also forbid the use of computers or photography without clearance. And as a result, there's at least one very cool unintended consequence, as the island's nature, the trees and bushes, are some of the most untouched environments of New York City. Beyond that, as mentioned before, the island features a historic lighthouse overlooking Orient Point and Plum Gut Channel. Near that is Building 257, which was once used for ammunition storage and animal research. Down the shoreline from there are the eerie remains of Fort Terry, now in a state of deterioration. Even so, the aging barracks and the helipad are still on standby for delivering disease samples in the event of an emergency. Given that it was a largely closed-off island for the better part of a century, it's no wonder that the mystique of Plum Island has impacted culture. It's referenced in the 1988 novel The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris as a creepy and potential supervised vacation site for a serial killer, Hannibal Lecter, though that does not occur. And the plot is also mentioned in the 1991 movie adaptation of the novel. There's also an entire mystery novel named after it, Plum Island by Nelson DeMille, portraying the investigation into the murder of 2 Plum Island scientists. But perhaps the most noteworthy publicly known event of the island happened on July the 12th, 2008, when a 4-legged, unidentified animal washed ashore at Ditch Plains Beach near Montauk, New York, Dubbed the Montauk Monster, some have said it was from Plum Island, and others said that it was the bloated carcass of a normal dog. And to calm everyone's nerves, authorities pointed out that mutant experimentation is firmly outside of Plum Island Animal Disease Center's boundaries. And given that the island's findings are shared in academic forums, if this happened on the island, we would have most probably heard similar stories by now. Finally, there was a great deal of concern about the island recently, considering its facility was slated for closure in 2023. The island was to be put up for auction to the private sector, and the facility itself relocated to Kansas. But as far as the public was concerned, this was a problematic proposition. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, journalists and politicians alike considered the sale a likely occurrence, lamenting that this largely preserved slice of nature would become some sort of resort. However, as a part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, in response to the most recent pandemic outbreak, the island was instead slated to be offered to the federal agencies first. Then, if no one took the deal, the state and local government agencies also had the option to keep the land out of private hands. In fact, as of recording this video in February of 2024, the facility still operates at Plum Island. Plum Island's future is still up in the air. It's not clear if the facility will remain where it is or move out. Regardless, the facilities continue to operate, studying the threats posed by foreign animal disease to this day. And with that in mind, what I suppose we can all hope is that with quite literal airtight security, for as long as it operates, Plum Island will continue to analyze the threats posed by diseases before they strike. Thank you all for watching and subscribing, and until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.